Hello and welcome to Dialogue of Civilisations. Ukraine's geopolitical identity is not shrouded in obscurity, but it is one of some complexity. The ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war has not just brought to the fore some of the tensions within and surrounding the country, competing narratives as to Ukrainian identity itself and the nation's place in the world, but also the very fundamental question as to its fate. Is Ukraine bound to be the battlefield exemplifying the clash of civilizations? Does it still have a chance to be the place for dialogue between two different worldviews and outlooks? The impression given is that the date of 24th of February 2022 has irreversibly changed Ukraine's destiny. The ongoing war will not just impact the fate of Ukraine as a sovereign and ethno-territorial being, but its sense of self with long-term, perhaps permanent implications for its place in the grand scheme of Dialogue of Civilizations. What's currently happening on the battlefield in Ukraine exemplifies clash, dichotomy, mutually exclusive worldviews pursued by different actors, yet what the future holds remains unclear. Today I will try to throw a penetrative glance at the inextricable connection between modern Ukraine's national and geopolitical identities, the current state of affairs enveloping the ongoing war, the possibility of a ceasefire deal, and other circumstances of import. My guest today is Victor Rudd, a prominent American attorney, foreign policy analyst, and chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the Ukrainian American Bar Association, New York City, United States.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Before 2014, many analysts and onlookers historians had been describing Ukraine as a country split between pro-European West and pro-Russian East. And some people still do take this description for granted. To what extent does this interpretation as to what Ukraine is, or rather was at the time, fit the bill in the first place?
It does and it does not. Fundamentally, the development of a modern Ukrainian national identity in the 19th century was actually established and began in Eastern Ukraine. And as we all know, at least as far as European countries are concerned, it is a fairly recent development that we have the countries that we identify today as Germany, as Italy, France, so on and so forth. That is, in historical time duration, a recent development. Ukraine developed that as well. The reason for this perception, or I should say misperception, between East and West doesn't even begin to touch the reality that the so-called Russian Federation itself is an imperial structure, as was the Soviet with its various republics. And in Ukraine, the dichotomy on the surface was only because of the long-standing, forcible Russification of Ukraine under the Tsars for over 300 years, which did not extend to the western part of Ukraine, which was under the control of other European powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Poland, for example. And the drive to Polonize, for example, Western Ukraine, didn't even begin to approach the, I will say, homicidal of extinction of Ukrainian language and culture in the East. So we have the paradox of the East, again, being the foundation of modern Ukrainian national identity, being virtually eliminated as a result of Russification, most notably on its face, seen and manifested by language. That is one of the methods of Russification. If you read Dostoevsky, If you read Pushkin's poetry about the Russian conquest of the Caucasus, you will see that Russian approach for conquest, in addition to military conquest, is not to separate non-Russian nations, but to Russify them and to force them to identify themselves as Russians. In Western civilization, discrimination against other national minorities is condemned because it is a segregation and a separation of those national and ethnic minorities. With Russia, it is the opposite. It is the, I would call it very honestly, the brainwashing of entire societies so that they lose their identity of who and what they are linguistically and otherwise, and consequently, ultimately, in the long run, do not offer any opposition to Russian rule.
Thank you.
Today, in Ukraine, I would simply say that separation, that dichotomy, was only on the surface. Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, 25 kilometers from the Russian border, is one of the most, one of the strongest oppositions that you will see to the Russian invasion.
Thank you very much indeed for your detailed explanation of that particular perceived dichotomy to which I made reference during my first question. Yes. But still, how does the connection between Ukraine's national and geopolitical identities look like to you? To what extent do you think that Ukraine's national characteristics have ultimately determined its geopolitical position and challenges that the nation is presently facing?
The so-called challenge is the threat, of course, of Russian reconquest. It is a struggle and a threat that Ukraine has been battling against for over 300 years. This is nothing new right now. And the fundamental point is that although Western commentators and analysts like to talk about Russians' fear of NATO, so on and so forth, that is absolutely wrong. I can get into that a little bit later on if you'd like. But the fundamental point about Ukraine is that it is fundamentally, by national character, a very, very democratic society, unlike Russia. People who know European history know the document, the Magna Carta in England in the 12th century, signed by King John as the establishment of rights and privileges for the common people. That was forced upon England by the king. In Ukraine, that was voluntarily done two centuries earlier. Women had equal rights. In Russia, for example, or in Ukraine, I'll say in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I'm giving you only these examples that are never recognized, but they illustrate the democratic rooting, ROOT, of Ukrainian society and national consciousness, which is the cause for the invasion today. In the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the priest is not allowed to invite his bishop without the consent of the people in the church. It is very, very democratic. I can give you many examples. Ukraine developed the first constitution for a democratic representative government 77 years before the United States, and has always tended toward a democratic society. The one gap and the one problem Ukrainians always have had is that they are enormously distrustful of central authority. Unfortunately, that was one of the reasons why Ukrainians have a difficulty establishing and maintaining a strong enough central state that will control the situation. They are individuals to the ultimate extreme. And that is the opposite of the Russian history, their societal culture, so on and so forth. And consequently, the geopolitical tension that you mentioned is, as far as Russia is concerned, is focusing precisely on Ukraine. If you look at Russia, and if you took, or I should say, not Russia, but the so-called Russian Federation, which I hope everybody understands, remains an imperial structure and encompasses dozens and dozens upon of submerged nations. But if you took the border of the Russian Federation and if you stretch it around the earth, around the globe at the equator, it would extend around the equator more than 1 times. Russia does not need more territory. The part of the Russian Federation west of the Ural Mountains is bigger than India and Turkey. Calculate the percentage of additional territory that Russia would achieve if it reconquered all of Ukraine. It is no more than perhaps a percentage.
Indeed.
So the issue is for Russia and for the United States and what I will call for the rest of the free world is the example that Ukraine serves for the Russia itself, for not so much perhaps for Russians, but for the other nations within the Russian Federation, an example of a vibrant, successfully, economically successful, democratic state on the border, on the Black Sea. This is something that Putin cannot tolerate. You may remember 2014. Why did Putin invade? And I should say that the plans for the invasion of the Crimean Peninsula were already being discussed 2 days after Ukraine declared sovereignty in the 1990s. Their concern was to allow Ukraine to develop independently and to be an example and therefore a threat, by example, to Russia's control of its own population. The West does not understand that fundamental point. I do not know what the situation is in Azerbaijan or in the other nations of the Caucasus, or indeed with the former republics in Central Asia. But I can tell you that the educational system in the West, in Europe, and in the United States and North America established so-called Russian studies were established by Russian professors who fled the communist revolution, who went west and established the foundation of Russian studies. And it was imperial history that anything and everybody is Russia, including Ukraine. That is the way American and Western academics and politicians and the media were educated. And it is very difficult for them to understand this very, very critical difference that I mentioned to you.
Well, it actually struck me. I'm a football fan, and I know that the Soviet national team was quite powerful and good, and they achieved many things. In relation to Soviet Union as a nation, the term Russia has been historically applied. For example, it is quite a fascinating moment that back in 1988, the national team of USSR was largely comprised of players of the Ukrainian team, Dynamo Kiev, but still it was largely referred referred to as a Russian national team. The reason why I'm giving this example, in order to explain to you the way we feel about this particular matter, we understand the complexity of Soviet Union. We understand it is not proper to refer to it as Russia in that particular sense. Allow me to put to you this question. I think that your answers have explained everything in the crystal clear way, but still, would you say that this ongoing war, which actually started back in 2014, I talk about the current phase of the conflict, made reconciliation with Russia an utter impossibility, rendering the nation's, Ukraine's European future an absolute inevitability? Do you share this sentiment without any reservations?
What happened at the end of World War II with Germany? There was admission, acknowledgement, apology, reparations, punishment. What happened when the Soviet Union fell apart?
There was no...
Was any of this forthcoming from Moscow? No. You had the very opposite. You had pride. You had denial. Until the crimes that were committed by the Russian society, if they are admitted and acknowledged, forget about payment and reparations. We are talking about admission of a long and bloody history, the suppression of very many nations. You know, of course, I'm sure, the history of suppression of Islam and the Muslim nations of the former Soviet Union. And of course, it wasn't just them, it was Christian nations as well. So without that, and now even more terror, murder, I will not go through the list, the kidnapping, the murder of children for education, brainwashing purposes. The issue of reconciliation suggests a mutuality of conciliation, right? There is no mutuality here. And this is not a question of a year or two or three. The unfortunate thing is for the West, let me reserve my further comment perhaps, because I wanted to make another point about your football team analogy and the like, which is very, very, very important. But I will reserve that perhaps for later on. I don't know if I answered this particular question for you adequately.
Okay. Allow me to put to you one question which may seem to be relatively irrelevant to the current debate, but it is related to Azerbaijan and some form of cooperation between Azerbaijan and Ukraine, which was discussed in the past. I'm talking about this organization called GUM. It's called as GUAM, Organization for Democracy and Economic Development, comprised of Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. This was effectively the Eastern Partnership arrangement minus Armenia and Belarus. And some people believe that it was a brainchild of the now late former Azerbaijani president Heydar Aliyev. That organization gained an observer status in the UN General Assembly, and even there was a free trade area agreement signed back in 2002. Do you think that the opportunities offered by that particular platform has been properly used by constituent members, including Azerbaijan and Ukraine? The reason why I'm particularly referring to the particular platform, because that did seem to be a platform uniting those former Soviet countries in such a way that Russia did seem to be less perturbed, and there did seem to be a chance for some sort of progress, but those chances have not been properly used. What is your reflection on that particular platform?
I cannot comment intelligently on it in any helpful manner. I have not followed that very closely. I will offer the following comment, that when you look at, and I'll start on a slightly different point. When you look at Russia, it has an economy today, or recently, approximately the size of New York City or the state of Texas. The economy of the United States is 25% of the world economy. You add Europe, and it's half of the world economy. You add China, South Korea, Australia, and the like elsewhere, and you have approximately 2/3 of the world economy. They have not been able to deter, prevent, stop, or reverse Russian aggression and violation of the most fundamental principles that have guided the world since World War II. Why not? Because Russia is an expert in disintegrating, separating country from country, and disintegrating internal societies. We don't know and we don't understand it. What does this mean, and what does this have to do to your question? That any connection, economic, cultural, whatever it is, between the nations who know and have experienced, who were either part of the Soviet Union or have experienced Russian aggression, any connection, program is good conceptually and absolutely necessary. There has to be a coalition of countries, of nations, starting from Finland in the north, the Baltic nations, Poland, even Belarus, but not under the current state. The entire, I will call it a crescent, if you will, that swings down south and then east into the Caucasus and Azerbaijan, and even the Central Asian republics. That is why this is, as I say, it is an inadequate, it's not even a response to your point, because I have not followed the organization's activities very closely at all. But as a concept, it is absolutely vital. It does not necessarily have to be a military alliance, but communication, common ground, and ongoing discussions are absolutely critical.
With your permission, I would like to move into the current state of affairs enveloping the battlefield in Ukraine. And US Secretary of State nominee Mark Rubio recently stated that there was no way Russia will be able to take all of Ukraine, but also he added that Ukraine would not be able to retake all of its sovereign territories held currently by Russia, adding that Russia and Ukraine must take concessions to end war. And also he added that prudence in the conduct of foreign policy does not amount to an abandonment of American values. What do you make of this language employed, and what does concession mean here, in particular as far as Ukraine is concerned? What kind of concessions are we talking about when it comes to that possible ceasefire deal, which foreign policy analysts have been discussing for some considerable time?
I don't know, but in my estimation, the entire approach is absolutely wrong, and it's hypocritical. Rubio began his testimony before the Senate for Secretary of State with the statement, "What Putin has done is unacceptable." And then what happened? He proceeded to accept what Putin did. Anything less than if the United States in particular, but I will call it the West, call it the free world, and by the West I don't just mean geographically, but even in the democratic nations in Asia. Anything less than a return to where the world was before 2014, a return to the agreements, dozens of international agreements that have been already negotiated and in force for 75 and 80 years. What those agreements require. If you move away from that, you have lost. We then become hypocrites. We talk and we do one thing, and yet surrender of territory, and it will not be the end of what Putin wants, because ultimately, although he sees Ukraine, as I said before, as a threat by example to ongoing Russian control within the Russian Federation. He sees Ukraine as the fulcrum or the lever to turn the so-called world order upside down and in the process crush American leadership. And that will not stop even if he is able to physically occupy the entirety of Ukraine. We are already long into that process, unfortunately. People are not aware. There is no discussion by commentators and experts, so-called experts, the same ones who confused the Soviet Union with Russia, going back to your example, a massive strategic disaster. But people do not talk about the fact that the most fundamental rule in international law about the sanctity of borders and national sovereignty, we already accepted in 2014 when Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and then, of course, went into the other parts of eastern Ukraine. But fundamentally, we reconciled ourselves to the annexation of Crimea. That is a green light for Putin. It was a green light for Putin. What did we do? What were our sanctions? Essentially nothing. You had your tragedy with your airplane on December 29th. Indeed. Does anybody still remember Malaysia Flight 17 in July of 2014? Did it wake anybody up? No. People screamed and yelled. Any punishment for Russia? None. Any punishment for the Soviet Union when they shut down Korean Airlines 007 in the 1980s? No. Any punishment for Russia now with what happened to the Azerbaijani flight? No.
Not yet.
And it is so bad that Biden's first global security document, when he came into office in 2021, did not mention Ukraine one single time, even though Crimea was annexed, and that was massive violation that should have never been allowed. So basically, I am not very optimistic. Today's people talk about ceasefire. What's the goal? What is the goal of what I will call the free world? What is our purpose? With no goal, with no purpose, we don't have a strategy. A ceasefire is not a goal. It's not a goal. But ceasefire.
It's described to be an interim solution, but not a permanent one. Of course, in fact, there is a school of...
No. Wait. Excuse me. A solution. I apologize for interrupting you. A solution to what? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? We have not identified that problem, even though it has been staring us in the face for a decade. Right? We can have a ceasefire. There can be the kind of ceasefire that there was in Korea with 37,000 Americans since 1951. But there was no solution. The country's still divided, yes, with the communists having taken the northern part, as you know. So that is what a lot of people, as a part of human nature, like. They want to reduce the temperature. Let's stop the war. Let's make nice, and then we'll figure things out later. No, in this case, it will be even worse.
Yes.
In 2004, I wrote a letter to Condoleezza Rice, who was President Bush's national security advisor, and she was to be the Secretary of State based on Senate hearings the following month in January of 2005. I warned her that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. How the United States and the rest of the world was going to react would determine the global security structure and America's global deterrence credibility for the future. And unfortunately, that is what happened. I warned her that Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. Everybody laughed. Well, 3 months later, in April of 2005, Putin, as I'm sure you remember, said the greatest tragedy of the 20th century.
Yes.
So this is nothing new. We have ignored it. There are reasons for it. I've written about it, but I see nothing good whatsoever coming out of any kind of so-called settlement discussions.
Even those people who
The war can only end one way.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your reflections. And even those people who say that we need to find some kind of interim solution, the term solution may not be applicable here, but there's a school of thought that in line with which even ceasefire is attained now, it will be only temporary without transforming into peace treaty. And the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will retain its sort of perpetual nature, assuming generational scope. I heard this point of view as well. I also would like to ask about the example of Azerbaijan. As you know, Azerbaijan, we earlier talked about the sanctity of national borders, international law. Azerbaijan recovered its territorial integrity back in 2020 and finalized its process in September 2023. And Azerbaijan's problem was with Russia. There was a separate entity inside Azerbaijan which was Russian-backed as well. Do you think there's anything, although Ukraine's predicament is massive, we understand the wider geopolitical picture, is there anything Ukraine could potentially learn from Azerbaijan's experience in terms of doing the right thing at the right time, the sense of timing and so forth?
I don't know. I know that there is tremendous interest and a lot of informed people in Ukraine who know intimately the history and the suffering and the trials of the entire, I will call it the Caucasus region, but technically the Caucasus are further south. So I would say the area partially today called Russia, but between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, including Azerbaijan. And the lessons to be learned from that, I believe there are, again, I have not dived into it, but the problems with Ukraine are so much greater and so much longer lasting and going to the foundation of the Russian psychology that I don't know how much can be learned. Some can, but I don't know how much and how consequential it is. If you allow me just one other comment, I think it's very, very telling in terms of the line of questions that I perceive you're asking me. Pavel Sudoplatov was Stalin's favorite assassin. He assassinated Leon Trotsky. He operated a spy network to penetrate the American secret atomic bomb project. He drew up psychological profiles of Roosevelt and Churchill at the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II. And in his memoirs, he begins the book with a very interesting statement that Russia has been at war with Ukraine almost from forever. And it only stopped, but he writes, the war against Ukraine stopped formally stopped only when the world recognized the independence of Ukraine. So the window was kept open. The war continued even after declaration of independence. The war continued, not kinetically, but preparations for a kinetic war continued, although it was not formal. So this modifier, the word formal, tells you a lot of where Moscow's thinking was back then and at what remains. So I'm afraid that what we're talking about is going to be the continuation of much, much more suffering and bloodshed. A ceasefire will maybe make things less for a period of time, then it will get worse. And unless the West, the entirety of Western countries, understand the necessity that Russia has to be pushed back at least to its original Russian Federation borders. I'm not even talking about implementing a policy or a purpose or a goal for the freedom of the non-Russian nations within the Russian Federation. Americans are absolutely terrified about that. But we had it with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell apart. If Ukraine had its nuclear arsenal, if it was not forced to give it to the Russians, Putin has said very clearly he never would have invaded Ukraine. It's too big of a risk.
Thank you.
So as you can tell, I unfortunately am not very optimistic, barring some sort of unexpected development, which is, of course, the way history operates.
And it seems to me, on the basis of your answers, that this grim possibility of a truncated Ukraine still remains something.
I'm sorry, trying to what?
Truncated Ukraine. Truncated Ukraine. In the fullness of time is something that you cannot exclude as a remote possibility, because you are not very optimistic, as I understand, as you made very clear yourself. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation. I'm so grateful to you. Although the key focus here is on Ukraine, allow me to put my very last question to you. You described Russia, modern Russia, as an imperial power. Do you think could it remain imperial by its very nature, but still acceptable as a player from your perspective? Or do you think being imperial is something which should be dealt with in a robust way? And perhaps you could give me the description of Russia which will be acceptable, ideal.
Well, of course, I am not living there. I am not experiencing what people in Ukraine and other parts, in the other parts of that world. And indeed, even if they're not in Ukraine, just as Azerbaijan has experienced Russia historically in many different ways. If Russia basically has never been a nation state. It has always been expanding and absorbing and ruling over other people. That is their identity, and that essentially is their reason to exist. The only thing that I can think of that would make Russia stop and rethink its North Star, its guiding light, its compass, is a defeat, what it would consider a defeat, of being pushed out of Ukraine. That is the only thing I think right now that I see on the table that's visible to me. I'm sure there could be other reasons as well. The likelihood of Western powers wanting to do that because they have been blackmailed by Putin with his nuclear arms, the likelihood, I think, of that is very, very small. But there is, as I'm sure you know, and other people in Azerbaijan and other areas of the former Soviet Union, there is a growing sense of awareness, self-awareness on the part of a lot of the nations in Russia, a dissatisfaction, some of it not based on national or even linguistic terms, but in the Russian Far East, the nations there do not like the idea that their resources are being stripped by Russia, and revenues coming back from Moscow is just a fraction of it. There is dissatisfaction. Where it will go, we don't know.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I'm so grateful to you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a great opportunity. I hope to do it again.
It's a great pleasure
Bye-bye.
and privilege. Thank you. This was Victor Rudd, a prominent American attorney and foreign policy analyst from New York City, with whom we have discussed some of the key elements of the modern Ukrainian identity, the nation's present predicament, and its future. Looking forward to welcoming you to the next episode of Dialogue of Civilizations.